Karen was down to her last dollar, cold, hungry, and invisible to the world, until one rainy afternoon changed everything. She gave her last meal to a total stranger, without realizing who he truly was, a powerful CEO who had lost himself, forgotten by the world. But that simple act of kindness triggered a transformation neither saw coming. One meal that would rewrite two lives forever. Stick around, because sometimes the greatest miracles start in the smallest moments. Please leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. And when you're done, don't forget to rate the story from 1 to 10. Happy traveling. Karen stood in front of the bakery, counting coins with trembling fingers. It wasn't enough for a full meal, just a single piece of bread and a coffee. But she smiled anyway, grateful for one more warm bite on a cold day. Behind her, life moved fast. Cars, phones, people lost in their own world. She was invisible, and she had gotten used to it. She found a bench in the small square, sat down, and opened the paper bag. The smell of bread felt like comfort, even if it wouldn't last long. Just as she took a bite, a sound made her pause. A cough, rough and sharp. Across the bench, a man sat hunched, soaked to the bone, eyes closed. His hands trembled with cold, and something inside Karen stirred. He looked worse than she felt. No umbrella, no coat, just layers of wet fabric and a lost expression. Karen glanced at her bread, then back at him. She hesitated for only a second, then stood up. In quiet steps, she crossed the distance between them. "Here," she said, voice soft. The man opened his eyes, green, tired, surprised. "For me?" he asked, hoarse and hesitant. She nodded, and placed the bag beside him. "You look like you need it more." He stared at her for a moment, as if trying to read her heart. "Thank you," he whispered. It sounded like he hadn't said the word in years. Karen smiled faintly, turned around, and walked away. Her stomach still growled, but her soul felt oddly full. She didn't know she had just fed a man who once owned half the city. His name was Jimmy, but no one knew that anymore. To the world, he had vanished. To himself, he was still trying to breathe. Once the CEO of a chain of restaurants, now he was just a shadow. He'd walked away after the scandal, after the betrayal, after losing everything. But it wasn't money he'd lost. It was purpose. He watched Karen disappear around the corner, leaving only kindness behind. No camera, no pity, no strings, just one human to another. And that one act shattered something inside him, because it had been so long since someone gave without expecting, and longer still since someone saw him. He took a bite of the bread. It was soft, warm, and honest. Like her, Jimmy wiped the corner of his mouth and stood. He didn't know why, but he had to find her. Something about her made him feel alive again. Karen didn't look back. She had no idea what she'd done. To her, it was just another hard day, another choice to stay kind. But something shifted that night. For both of them, something invisible but deeply felt. As the rain picked up, Jimmy found shelter under a storefront awning. He tucked the paper bag into his coat like it was treasure. That small meal meant everything. And the woman who gave it? He wasn't going to forget her face. The city glowed, in wet reflections, blurred lights, and silent people. Jimmy blended in, unseen, like he had for months. But tonight, he felt different, seen, remembered, real. He didn't even know her name, but he knew what he felt. Hope. Hope was dangerous. It made you want to try again. It whispered that maybe life wasn't over. It told you stories about healing, even if you didn't believe them yet. And Jimmy was listening. He walked for blocks, not sure where she'd gone. His shoes were soaked, his hands numb, but his eyes were searching for the girl with kind eyes and an open hand, for the one who gave more than food. Karen, meanwhile, returned to her small rented room. It smelled like damp wood and dreams too long shelved. She hung her wet coat by the heater and sat on the floor. Dinner was done. Hunger remained, but she'd do it again. She had learned that when you have nothing, giving is a rebellion, a way of saying, I may be broke, but I'm not broken. And that night, she chose generosity over survival. It wasn't smart, but it was human, and it made her feel powerful. Jimmy reached the bakery again, hoping for a clue. It was closed, the lights off, the world asleep. Still, he stood there for a while, replaying her words. You look like you need it more. She didn't know how right she was. Inside him, old gears began to turn. Not of business, not yet, but of purpose. She gave, she saw, she stayed kind. And maybe he could become someone who deserved that. Not just a man with money, but a man with meaning. The city was quiet now, soft in its loneliness. Jimmy walked back to his shelter spot, mind racing. For the first time in months, he wanted to remember, wanted to feel, wanted to start again. Karen didn't sleep much that night. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain. Her stomach ached, but her heart didn't. Because sometimes giving feels better than receiving, even when the world says otherwise. Neither of them knew that their paths would cross again, that this wasn't the end of the story, only the spark. Sometimes the smallest acts create the loudest echoes, and sometimes a piece of bread can rewrite a life. Or two. At sunrise, Karen woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Another day of trying, of hoping someone would call her name. She dressed in silence, tied her curls, and left with a tired smile. The city didn't wait for anyone, but she still moved with grace, because what she gave yesterday had to matter today. Jimmy sat on the bench once more, this time with purpose. He held the empty bag like a relic, a reminder of something real. It wasn't just food. It was dignity wrapped in brown paper. And he knew now, he didn't want to disappear again. Not when someone like her still existed in the world. And so, their story had begun, without fireworks or fanfare. Just a small moment. A look. A meal. The kind of beginning you almost miss. Unless you're watching closely. Because the biggest changes don't start with noise. They start with kindness. The next morning, Karen walked to the community center with slow, steady steps. Twice a week, she volunteered there, organizing donations, serving soup, folding clothes. It didn't pay, but it made her feel useful, helping others distracted, her from the weight of her own needs. And maybe, just maybe, someone would finally notice her resume on the wall. She wore the same coat as always, patched at the elbows, clean but tired. Her curls were tied back loosely, strands escaping. In the breeze, the city around her buzzed with indifference. But the small building ahead felt like an island of purpose. A place where her name, sometimes, still mattered. Inside, she greeted the staff with her usual quiet smile. "Morning, Karen," someone said from behind a stack of boxes. She waved, set down her bag, and started sorting canned goods. Her hands moved automatically. Her mind didn't, because her thoughts kept drifting back to him. The man from the bench. He hadn't looked like someone with much to give, but there had been something in his eyes, something fragile. She hadn't meant to remember, but she did, and it made her wonder if he'd eaten since then. Across the city, Jimmy hadn't slept either. He'd spent the night at the shelter, staring at the ceiling. The bread was gone, but the feeling remained. Someone had seen him, and that meant more than food ever could. He left early, walking through streets that still felt like strangers. His clothes were cleaner now, thanks to a donation bin. He trimmed his beard in the public restroom mirror, tried to look less invisible, tried to look like someone she might recognize. He went back to the bakery, the one where she'd bought the bread. Inside, the woman behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you?" Jimmy hesitated. "Do you know a woman? Brown coat, curly hair." The woman blinked. "You mean Karen?" His heart jumped at the name. "She volunteers nearby," she said. "Community center. Just 2 blocks." Jimmy nodded, murmured a thank you, and turned toward the door. His feet moved fast. His hands trembled. At the community center, Karen had just finished stacking bags of rice. She wiped sweat from her brow and reached for the next box. When the door creaked open, she barely looked up, until the silence behind it stretched too long, and she felt a presence familiar. She turned, and there he was, no longer soaked or hunched or trembling, but still him. His eyes found hers like they'd been waiting, and everything else in the room disappeared. "You," she breathed. Jimmy gave a nervous smile. "I never got to thank you properly," he said. Karen stepped closer, unsure if it was real. "You didn't have to come back." "I wanted to," he replied, hands in his pockets. "I didn't know your name that night." "Karen," she said softly. "Just Karen." He smiled again. "I'm Jimmy," and for the first time in months, he meant it. The noise of the center returned slowly. Voices, laughter, clatter of dishes. But they stood in their quiet bubble, like before. 2 people connected by something wordless. Something that hadn't ended with a piece of bread. "Do you work here?" he asked, eyes scanning the shelves. She shook her head. "No, I just help out when I can." Jimmy nodded slowly. "Figures. You look like someone who helps." Karen blushed, not used to compliments that sounded honest. Most people didn't notice her at all. "Are you okay now?" she asked. His smile faded a little. "Getting there." He paused. "You help more than you know." Karen didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and smiled. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. "We just made soup." He looked down, then up again. "Only if you sit with me this time." Karen hesitated, then said, "Deal." They sat at a corner table, 2 bowls of soup steaming. Gently, the room buzzed around them, but they had their own rhythm. They talked about books, about music, about cities they missed. Not big things, not painful things, just human things. Karen spoke with quiet joy, voice low and steady. Jimmy listened like he was remembering how. No one interrupted. No one stared. Because sometimes connection isn't loud. It's just there. When they finished, she took their bowls to the kitchen. He followed, drying his hands on a towel. They moved like people who'd done this before. But they hadn't. Not really. They stood near the sink, shoulders almost touching. Karen turned to him. "Why did you come back?" Jimmy looked at her without flinching. "Because that night, you reminded me I still exist." And her heart ached at the truth in his voice. She didn't speak right away, just let the silence settle like dust. Then, quietly, "Everyone deserves to be seen." He nodded, eyes wet. Not everyone knows how to look. They walked to the door together, neither rushing. Outside, the city waited, loud, sharp, indifferent. But for a moment, it didn't matter. Jimmy turned to her. "Will I see you again?" Karen smiled. "I'm usually here, Thursdays and Sundays." He took a step back, hesitant, then said, "Thank you again." Karen touched his sleeve lightly. "You already said that." He smiled. "Then I'll keep saying it." She watched him walk away, hands in pockets, head held higher. Something about him felt different now. Not fully healed, but open, like someone returning to life. Like someone choosing to stay. Inside, Karen leaned against the wall, breath slow. Her chest fluttered with something unexpected. Not romance. Not yet. But something warmer than she'd felt in a long time. Something like hope. And outside, Jimmy kept walking, past strangers, past noise. But this time, with direction, with purpose, and one name echoing gently in his heart. Karen. Jimmy sat on a bench outside the community center, still feeling her presence. The warmth of the soup lingered, but it wasn't the food that fed him. It was her, Karen, her quiet strength, her eyes that didn't flinch. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt human, and that scared him more than anything. He hadn't told her the truth. Not yet. Because how do you explain falling from the top to nowhere? How do you tell someone kind that you were once powerful, but not always good? He wasn't sure she'd understand. Or worse, what if she did? That night, Jimmy returned to the shelter but didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and thought about her hand on his sleeve. Small gesture, huge impact. It had been so long since someone touched him with care. Not pity, not obligation, just presence. In the early morning light, he dug through his old backpack. There it was, a worn business card, edges soft with time. James Whitmore, founder, Whitmore Kitchens. Once, that name had meant respect, meetings, magazine covers. Now it meant nothing, not even to him. He stared at the card, thumb tracing. The fading letters. What would Karen think if she saw this? Would she feel lied to? Or worse, disappointed? He wasn't sure which scared him more. Karen, meanwhile, returned to the center like clockwork. She didn't expect to see him again, not so soon. But part of her hoped. She kept glancing at the door, even as she worked. And when it opened, her heart skipped. Jimmy stepped in, nervous, but determined. He held something in his hand, the card. Karen noticed it immediately, but it wasn't the card that made her pause. It was his expression, serious, unusually quiet. They sat in the small break room, the world muffled beyond the door. Jimmy placed the card between them. Karen looked down, then back at him. "What is this?" she asked softly. "My truth," he replied. She picked it up gently, eyes scanning the words, then looked at him again, really looked. "You're the Whitmore guy?" He nodded once. "I was. Maybe I still am. I don't know." "And the man on the bench?" she asked. He swallowed. "Also me. Maybe more me than the CEO ever was." Karen didn't speak, just leaned back in the chair. He waited for anger, for judgment, but it didn't come. Just silence and breath. "You don't owe me anything, Jimmy," she finally said. "I gave you bread because you were hungry. That's all." "I know," he whispered, "but you gave me something I didn't even know I needed." Karen tilted her head. "What's that?" "Permission to start over." Her eyes softened. "Then start." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know how." Karen smiled. "Most of us don't. That's why we need each other." And something inside him cracked open. They sat like that for a while, quiet, but connected. Jimmy felt lighter, like a stone had been set down. Karen reached for her tea, took a sip, and broke the silence. "So, Mr. Whitmore, what now?" He laughed, genuinely. "Please don't call me that." He told her about the restaurant he had seen. The empty one, 2 streets over, with dusty windows and promise. "I keep thinking about it," he admitted. Karen raised an eyebrow. "You want to start over? With food?" Jimmy shrugged. "Seems poetic, doesn't it?" They walked there after her shift, Karen curious, Jimmy quiet. The windows were dirty, but she could see the bones. Old wooden booths, a scratch counter, a sign that once said home. She pressed her hand to the glass. Could be something, she murmured. Jimmy stood beside her, watching her face more than the space. What would you name it? He asked. Karen smiled softly. Bread and Grace. He blinked. That's perfect. She shrugged. It's what brought us here. That night, he dreamed of warm lights and people smiling. Of Karen at the register, apron tied, writing quotes on a chalkboard. Of laughter, not silence. And of belonging. When he woke, he wasn't sure it had been a dream. Karen spent the evening in her room, sketching ideas on a napkin. A layout, a name, a menu. She didn't know why, didn't even know if he'd call. But it felt good to dream. It had been a long time. The next day, he was waiting outside the bakery. She almost dropped her coffee. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. Jimmy smiled. I wasn't sure you'd believe in me. Karen took a sip. I believe in potential. They visited the space again, this time with a notebook. Jimmy took measurements. Karen took pictures. They argued about chairs, laughed, about wall colors. And somewhere in the middle of it all, they forgot to be afraid. Jimmy pulled out an old folder with contact names. Suppliers, contractors, people he once trusted. Karen added names from her neighborhood, volunteers, cooks, helpers. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that made it powerful. Karen brought a small plant and placed it in the window. This is ours now, she said. Jimmy watched her, heart full. He didn't touch her hand, but he wanted to. Instead, he nodded. Let's make it matter. He sent a message to an old investor that night. Not to ask for help, but to say goodbye. That chapter was done. This one was written in her handwriting. Simpler, braver, truer. Karen stood in the middle of the empty restaurant. She closed her eyes and breathed in the dust. It didn't smell like failure. It smelled like a beginning, like grace settling in the cracks. Outside, people passed by without noticing the place. But one day they would. They would walk in, sit down, and feel something quiet and deep. Because some places aren't built to impress. They're built to hold people who are rebuilding themselves. And inside, Jimmy and Karen stood side by side, no longer strangers. No longer bound by the past, but held by something stronger. A choice, a second chance, and a little restaurant that would soon be called Bread and Grace. The days that followed were filled with paint-stained clothes and hopeful chaos. Karen and Jimmy cleaned every surface, scrubbed away the dust of abandonment. Their hands worked, but their silences spoke louder. In those quiet moments, trust began to settle between them, not from promises, but from presence. Karen arrived each morning with a thermos of tea and 2 mismatched mugs. Jimmy would unlock the door already holding a broom, his eyes lighter. Each time, there was no script, no plan set in stone, just shared effort, laughter, and pauses that didn't need to be filled. And somehow that was enough. One evening, as they organized old menus, Jimmy turned serious. He held a faded photo in his hands, a group of chefs smiling beside him. This was before I forgot what food was for, he said. Karen looked at the faces. What was it for back then? Ego, he admitted. Not nourishment. Karen didn't push. She just nodded, her eyes kind, then placed a sticky note beside the photo. We start again. Jimmy stared at it for a long moment. That tiny note carried more grace than any speech. He left it taped to the fridge. They painted the walls light yellow, like sunlight in early spring. Karen danced with a roller in hand, streaks of color on her cheeks. Jimmy watched, laughing quietly, feeling the weight of years fall away. He hadn't smiled like that since before the scandals, the loss, the fall. She was reminding him who he used to be. They found an old record player in a thrift shop and brought it in. Every afternoon, soft jazz or old classics filled the space. Karen hummed along. Jimmy sometimes did too. The restaurant began to sound like home before it even opened, like something warm was waking up in the walls. One afternoon, a storm rolled in. Rain tapped gently on the windows as they sat sharing a sandwich. Jimmy stared at the drops in silence, then finally spoke. "My parents never thought I'd be enough without money." Karen looked at him softly. They were wrong. He swallowed hard, words caught in his throat. "I kept chasing success because I thought it would prove something." Karen reached for the thermos, refilled his mug. "You don't need to prove anything to me," she said. And somehow, that mattered more than applause ever did. They hung lights around the counter, soft and warm. Karen insisted on a blackboard for daily messages. The first one read, "You are seen. You are welcome." Jimmy stared at the words, his chest tightening. She had no idea how deeply they mirrored his journey. That night, they worked late, scrubbing the kitchen floor in silence. Suddenly, Karen stopped, sitting back on her heels. "Do you ever think you'll forgive yourself?" she asked. Jimmy blinked. "Sometimes I think I'm not supposed to," she replied gently. "Then maybe I'll do it first." The lights flickered. The air was still. Jimmy looked at her, truly looked. She wasn't pitying him. She was standing beside him, and that made all the difference. Karen returned home with tired legs but a heart that felt alive. She sat by the window, listening to the rain. A napkin sat folded in her bag, sketched plans for tomorrow. She smiled to herself. Dreams didn't feel distant anymore. Jimmy stayed behind, cleaning dishes that didn't need scrubbing. The silence felt sacred, not lonely. He looked around at what they were building. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a chance to live differently. He walked outside, still in his paint-streaked shirt. The city looked softer in the rain, and in the window's reflection, he didn't see a failure. He saw a man beginning again, and he whispered, "Thank you," to the night. The next morning, Karen brought muffins. "Donated," she said, placing them on the counter. Jimmy took one, surprised. "They taste better because they're shared," she teased. He grinned. "You always this poetic with pastry?" She shrugged. "Only with people who show up. Every day." He paused, muffin in hand. "I didn't used to. Not really." Karen sipped her tea. "But you do now." And that was enough. Together, they designed the menu on recycled paper. Simple dishes, honest ingredients. Karen wanted names that told stories: Second Chance Soup, Hope Toast. Jimmy didn't argue. He just smiled. It felt right. They practiced in the kitchen, burning the first 3 batches of biscuits. Karen giggled. Jimmy groaned. But then they got it right. Fluffy, warm, buttery. She clapped. He bowed. The room echoed with laughter and flour in the air. Each corner they cleaned revealed something forgotten. An old photo, a scuffed tile. They didn't hide the scars of the space. They embraced them, like their own lives, imperfect but worthy. It became part of the charm. A young boy from the shelter passed by one day. Karen invited him in, gave him juice and a smile. Jimmy watched, moved by how naturally she opened doors. Not just the physical ones, but the emotional ones too. He walked into the back room and cried quietly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of being seen. He wiped his face before returning. Karen said nothing, but her eyes met his with quiet understanding. They painted the front door last. Karen chose forest green, like fresh beginnings. Jimmy traced his hand on the handle before opening it. "This door," he said, "might save someone's life one day." Karen whispered, "Like it saved yours." The day they finished, they stood outside just staring at it. The sign wasn't up yet, but it didn't matter. "Bread and grace," Jimmy murmured. Karen smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's already open. In here." People passed, some curious, some indifferent, but they stood still, calm in their choice. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be honest, and that made all the difference. They turned off the lights and locked the door. No grand speeches, no ribbons, just a quiet nod between two people who rebuilt something sacred. Karen's voice broke the silence. "Tomorrow, we welcome the world." And as they walked away under the dim street light, Jimmy reached for her hand without thinking. She didn't pull away, because trust wasn't declared. It was earned, in silence, in soup, in grace. The morning arrived with golden sunlight piercing through the windows. Karen was the first to arrive, holding fresh flowers from the market. She arranged them in an old jar on the counter, hands slightly trembling. Not from fear, but from something sacred. This was the day they let the world in. Jimmy arrived moments later with 2 loaves of warm bread. The smell filled the space instantly. Comfort, memory, presence. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled, hair still damp from the shower. Karen smiled at him. He looked home. Outside, a few people were already curious. Neighbors peeked through the glass, whispers swirling around the name. Karen stepped out and flipped the sign open. Jimmy took a breath. It was time. The first customer was an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. She read the chalkboard. "You are welcome here. Always." Karen led her to a table with a smile. "Coffee or comfort first?" she asked softly. The woman chuckled. "Both, dear." Word spread faster than expected. By mid-morning, every table was filled. Voices rose gently, clinking spoons, murmured laughter. The space had never been so alive. And yet, it was peaceful. Jimmy moved quietly from table to table. He didn't speak much, but he noticed everything. The child who dropped a napkin. The man who looked tired but tried to smile. The way Karen lit up every corner. A local reporter entered with a camera crew. Karen froze for a second, eyes locking with Jimmy's. But he simply nodded and stepped into the kitchen. Karen welcomed them with grace. Her story wasn't shame, it was strength. They asked questions, snapped photos, filmed the room. Karen answered kindly, honestly. "It's not just a restaurant," she said. "It's a place for people who forgot what warmth feels like." The reporter lowered the mic, visibly moved. Behind the counter, Jimmy listened from the kitchen door. Her voice stirred something deep in him. She wasn't just building a place. She was building people, and he was one of them. The menu was simple: toast, soup, coffee, kindness. Every dish carried meaning, a piece of their journey. People didn't just eat. They lingered. They talked. They returned for seconds. A boy drew a picture on a napkin and handed it to Karen. It showed her smiling next to the bread sign. She blinked back tears, tucking it under the register. "We frame this later," she whispered to Jimmy. He just nodded, moved beyond words. At noon, the line reached the sidewalk. Volunteers from the shelter arrived to help. Karen handed out aprons. Jimmy gave a quick tour. The kitchen became a rhythm, a dance. And somehow it all worked. People shared tables with strangers. Stories flowed. Eyes met. Barriers fell. It wasn't magic. It was intention. The kind that's rare and unforgettable. Grace, plated with bread. Between orders, Jimmy caught Karen leaning against the back wall. Her eyes closed, face flushed with effort. He walked over and handed her a glass of water. She drank, then smiled faintly. "Remind me why we did this." He chuckled. "Because healing looks like this." She nodded. "Even when it's exhausting." He added, "Especially then." Their eyes locked. They didn't need to say more. In a quiet moment, Jimmy slipped into the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror. No longer the man in rags. Not quite the CEO again. Just Jimmy, becoming. Back at the counter, Karen wrote a new quote on the board. "Sometimes the smallest doors open the biggest hearts." A woman read it aloud and smiled. She didn't know who wrote it, but she felt seen. A regular entered, one who used to ignore Jimmy on the streets. Today, he greeted him with a nod. Jimmy returned it with quiet grace. No need for confrontation, just the slow work of changing perception. Karen handed out soup to a man who hesitated at the door. He looked rough, uncertain. She just said, "Hungry?" He nodded once and sat down. In the background, the record player spun a scratchy song. Something old, familiar, human. Karen hummed. Jimmy tapped the counter. The place felt like a heartbeat. Strong, rhythmic, present. As the sun lowered, the rush eased. Karen stepped outside for air, apron stained and hair messy. Jimmy joined her, holding 2 mugs of tea. They sat on the step, watching the street, not saying much. Finally, she turned to him. "I'm proud of us," she said. He looked down, then at her. "Me too. Especially you." She bumped his shoulder. "It's us or nothing." Inside, someone turned the lights down. A glow remained, soft and golden. Bread and Grace wasn't just open. It was alive, a vessel of second chances. They watched as people exited with warm eyes and fuller hearts, not just because of food, because of presence, of dignity offered freely, of love in action. Karen looked at Jimmy. "You okay?" He nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." She smiled. "Get used to it." He chuckled. "One meal at a time." And she replied, "One person too." That night, they didn't celebrate with champagne or speeches. They cleaned, locked up, and hugged in silence. 2 lives rebuilt by grace and the sound of bread breaking. Outside, the sign glowed like a quiet lighthouse. And inside, hope stayed lit. The news story aired 3 days later. It featured slow shots of the bread, the chalkboard, and the warm smiles. But what stunned the viewers most was the reveal. The man behind the counter was Jimmy Carter, once a disgraced millionaire. The headline read, "From CEO to soup line." The phone rang nonstop the next morning. Some were curious, some were cruel. Jimmy let it ring. Karen muted the volume and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's serve. Let the rest wait." Outside, a few people pointed through the window. Some came in to gawk, not to eat. Karen noticed it instantly. Her smile didn't falter, but her heart tightened. This place wasn't meant to be a circus. Jimmy stayed in the kitchen most of the day. His hands moved with focus, but his eyes carried weight. Not shame, but the fear of being reduced again. Karen slipped in at one point, holding 2 spoons. "Come taste the hope," she whispered. They tasted soup in silence. Steam curled between them like unspoken reassurance. "I'm not ready to be seen like that again," he admitted. Karen looked at him. "Then be seen differently. Start here." Her voice never pushed, only invited. By afternoon, a woman arrived with a microphone and questions. Karen intercepted her before she reached the tables. "This place isn't about headlines," she said calmly. "It's about healing. If you can't respect that, please leave." The woman hesitated, then quietly stepped out. Jimmy watched from the back door. He wasn't used to being defended, not without strings attached. But Karen did it naturally, because she believed in people, not power, especially not the kind that manipulates. A few customers didn't return that week, but new ones came, silent, soft-eyed, seeking warmth. The tables still filled, not with noise, but with need, and the space held it all. Bread and Grace became a place of quiet revolution. On Thursday, a man entered with hesitation. He wore a tailored coat, but his eyes were dim. Jimmy recognized him, a former investor. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, history screamed. Then Jimmy nodded, just once. The man sat. Karen served him with the same kindness as anyone else. She didn't ask, didn't assume. He left a note instead of a tip. "Thank you for remembering what matters." Karen found Jimmy leaning against the fridge later that night. "You okay?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Some ghosts bring flowers now, I guess." She smiled. "Let them. We have vases." The menu remained simple, unchanged. Karen refused to capitalize on the attention. "This place isn't built on your past," she said. "It's built on what we serve today." Jimmy nodded. That truth anchored him. One evening, someone spray-painted "Liar" on the back door. Jimmy found it at sunrise. He stared at the red letters for a long while, then picked up a bucket and began to scrub. Karen joined him without a word. Together, they cleaned the wall in silence. Then Karen grabbed a chalk and wrote on the side, "Grace doesn't erase. It rewrites." People began leaving kind messages. Around it, a wall of wounds turned to testimony. A local high school class came to volunteer. They painted shelves, washed dishes, listened to stories. One of them asked Jimmy, "Is it true you were rich?" He smiled gently, not the kind that mattered. And the kid nodded, understanding more than he knew. In the kitchen, Karen found Jimmy rereading an old article. It listed his crimes, his fall, his silence. She gently took it from him and placed it in the trash. "Not food, not fuel," she whispered, and kissed his forehead like a prayer. That night, the soup burned slightly. Karen laughed, fanning smoke with a towel. Jimmy panicked at first, old perfectionism flaring. Then he saw her giggling, eyes full of light. And he laughed too, for the first time in days. They danced in the kitchen while the windows stayed fogged. No music, just the rhythm of choosing joy. Outside, the city rushed by. Inside, time slowed. And healing happened in silly steps. Later, Karen wrote another message on the chalkboard. What we carry becomes lighter when we share it. People began writing their own beneath it, names, dates, hopes. It became a wall of human fingerprints. Jimmy added one quietly. "Today I stayed." A food critic stopped by unannounced. He didn't ask for Jimmy, didn't ask for photos. He ordered soup, ate in silence, then left. Later, his review read, "The flavor is grace. It stays on your tongue." Karen read it aloud, eyes wide. Jimmy smiled, surprised. "Maybe not all headlines are heavy," he said. She replied, "Only the honest ones." And they let that sink in. Volunteers started coming more often. People brought bread. Others offered time. The space became a woven net of care. Each person a thread. Each gesture a stitch. One evening, Karen found a note. Under her apron, "I came hungry. I left whole. Thank you." She held it like it was gold. Tears welled up. This was why they stayed. That night, Jimmy walked Karen home. They didn't speak much, just walked under the stars, listening to the city breathe. At her door, she turned to him. "I'm proud of you." He blinked, caught off guard, then said, "For staying?" For choosing different. Every single day. He nodded, throat tight. Then I'll keep choosing. Back at the restaurant, the lights were off, but the warmth remained. In the reflection of the glass door, Jimmy didn't see his past. He saw a man holding bread, not ego. He saw a name, Bread and Grace, and a purpose he'd never lose again. The first frost of the season kissed the windows with silver breath. Inside, Bread and Grace glowed like a fireplace in the night. Karen lit candles on each table, a ritual of care. Jimmy adjusted the chairs, checking for loose legs. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. A mother walked in carrying 2 children, coats too thin for the cold. Karen met them at the door, kneeling to the boys' level. "We've saved a table just for you," she said with a smile. The children's eyes widened. It wasn't food that fed them first, it was dignity. Jimmy brought out a bowl of hot soup, hands steady. He placed it down gently, as if it were sacred. The mother's eyes met his with silent thanks. No spotlight, no pity, just shared humanity. Later that evening, a man arrived wearing a suit and hesitation. He hovered near the door until Karen approached. "I don't need charity," he said, almost defensive. "We don't serve charity," she replied. "We serve people." He sat down, quietly undone by kindness. The table beside him was filled with laughter. College students, arms full of textbooks and tattered scarves. They came for the soup, but stayed for the safety. Jimmy recognized one as the son of a former board member. He served him anyway, without pause. Karen sat at a corner table with an elderly man who spoke little. He carried a worn notebook and occasionally nodded at her stories. When he left, he tore out a page and handed it to her. It read, "You remind me that silence can still be warm." She kept it in her apron pocket. A couple celebrated their anniversary that night. They didn't ask for candles or attention, just 2 bowls of the usual in each other's hands. Jimmy offered them a slice of cake on the house. "Not fancy," he said, "but it's made with staying." The wall near the door now held photos and notes. A collage of strangers who became community. One photo showed Karen and Jimmy laughing. In the kitchen, it had been taken by a volunteer, unposed, unplanned. It captured something deeper than smiles. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, someone began to sing softly. Others joined in, creating a tapestry of sound. No one led. No one performed. They just belonged. Jimmy leaned against the counter, eyes soft. "This is what I never bought with all my money," he whispered. Karen turned to him, smiling gently. "Because this can't be bought, only built." And they kept building. A teenage girl asked to volunteer. She had shy eyes and sleeves covering old scars. Karen gave her an apron and a list of small tasks. At the end of the night, the girl stayed to sweep. She said it helped quiet her thoughts. Jimmy watched her from the kitchen, heart tugged. He remembered what it felt like to be lost in noise, to have silence feel like punishment instead of peace. Here, it was different. Here, silence healed. A man in a wheelchair struggled to reach the door. Karen rushed out without hesitation, guiding him inside. She rearranged the tables to make space, without fanfare. He blinked, surprised. No one's ever done that. She just smiled. "You're here now." They shared stories over coffee refills. Stories about old jobs, younger dreams, and lost time. Karen listened with both ears and heart. He said, "This is the first time I felt useful." "Again," she whispered, "that feeling never expires." A woman came in crying, cheeks red from wind and pain. Karen wrapped a blanket around her before asking a single question. No clipboard, no intake form, just warmth. The woman later said, "That saved me more than food ever could." And it did. Jimmy stayed late that night scrubbing pots. Karen brought him a mug of tea and leaned against the wall. "You ever imagined this when you were rich?" He smiled. "Not once. But now I can't imagine anything else." They clinked mugs in a quiet toast. The next day, a package arrived. Inside, dozens of hand-knitted gloves and scarves. No note, just grace, scent and yarn. Karen laid them in a basket near the door. A sign read, "Take what keeps you warm." Jimmy added bread rolls beside it, not out of duty, but delight. A boy grabbed one and said, "This place tastes like hugs." Karen laughed. "Best compliment we've had." And it was. A deaf couple began frequenting the cafe. They taught Karen and Jimmy a few signs. "Thank you." "Welcome." "Peace." Soon others joined in, bridging gaps with gestures. The cafe learned to speak without words. One afternoon, Karen found Jimmy sitting alone. He was staring at an old photo, his parents at a business gala. "They never saw this version of me," he murmured. Karen placed her hand on his. "But this version matters most." A child spilled juice, panicked and tearful. Karen knelt beside her with a towel and a story. "Once, I spilled soup on a senator," she said with wide eyes. The girl giggled through her sniffles. The mess vanished. The memory stayed. Jimmy hosted a quiet hour one evening. Soft music, no talking, just presence. Some wrote, some wept, some rested. Afterward, a man approached him. I forgot what peace sounded like. Karen introduced a table of strangers night. Anyone could sit, anyone could join. At first, it felt awkward. Then it became magic. New friends, new beginnings. One bowl at a time. The lights flickered. Once, an old fuse, nothing serious. Karen and Jimmy laughed in the dark. Someone lit a candle. Then another. Then another. The glow grew. So did the love. Jimmy scribbled something on the menu board before closing. Every seat is sacred. Every name matters. Karen read it and nodded. That's our mission statement. And it was. That night, they locked the door in silence. The snow kept falling, blanketing the world in hush. Inside bread and grace, every crumb had meaning, and every person who walked in had a place. At their table, for all, winter deepened, wrapping the city in a white hush. Bread and grace opened earlier and closed later. Karen wore thicker scarves, her breath visible in the cold air. Jimmy arrived each morning before the sun, lighting every lamp. Warmth, they'd learned, was more than temperature. One morning, the letter arrived. A folded envelope slipped beneath the door. Karen opened it, brows furrowed. It was from a real estate agency. An offer, generous, tempting, to buy the cafe. Jimmy read it and went quiet. The sum could buy freedom, comfort, even closure. But it wouldn't buy meaning. He looked around the empty cafe. Nothing in him wanted to leave. Karen placed the letter on the table, untouched. "Some things aren't for sale," she whispered. Jimmy nodded. They didn't need a meeting. Their silence had already decided. Later that week, a woman arrived. With hesitation, she introduced herself as Jimmy's sister. Years of silence stood between them. Her eyes shimmered. "I saw the article. I had to come." Jimmy froze, but then stepped forward. They sat in the back, surrounded by the scent of bread. Karen gave them space, refilling their cups gently. Jimmy's voice cracked, but he spoke. Forgiveness didn't come easy, but it came. In teaspoons, not gallons. That evening, Jimmy stood alone by the window. Karen joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. I think I'm finally becoming the man I wish I'd been, he said. Her hand found his quietly. The city was preparing for Christmas. Lights lined the streets. Children laughed through scarves. Brett and Grace hosted a holiday meal. No reservations needed. They called it the long table, and it stretched through both rooms. Everyone brought something: a pie, a poem, a memory. Karen wrote each name on a long sheet of paper. Jimmy drew stars beside the names of those who came alone. Stars belong to the quiet ones, he said. Karen smiled. So do second chances. That night, the cafe hummed with joy. Music played softly, not loud enough to drown voices. Old friends reunited, new ones met. Laughter echoed like bells. Karen watched it all, heart full. Jimmy took the mic briefly, clearing his throat. He spoke not of wealth, but of wonder, not of power, but of presence. He thanked Karen, voice shaking. She gave me bread and reminded me of grace. Karen blinked back tears, stepping forward. She said only one sentence. Kindness writes stories no money ever could. The room stood in silence for a breath. Then applause filled the air like confetti. A boy approached after the meal, tugging Karen's sleeve. I want to make a place like this when I grow up. Karen knelt, meeting his eyes. You already started, just by saying that. He beamed. The team stayed after midnight, cleaning and laughing. Jimmy scrubbed dishes while humming. Karen folded aprons, pausing to read notes left behind. One read, I didn't believe in people. You changed that. She pressed it to her chest. Weeks passed. The snow melted. Spring whispered promises through the city. Brett and Grace hung fresh flowers by the window. Karen baked new recipes: lavender, cookies, rosemary bread. Life kept unfolding. Jimmy started writing again, not for headlines, but for healing. Short reflections on chalkboards, folded notes, even napkins. Karen collected them, calling them grace crumbs. She believed words could feed, too. One afternoon, a woman visited quietly. She looked at everything like it was a cathedral. Karen offered her tea. The woman said, My brother came here before he passed. This place was his peace. Karen simply placed her hand over hers. Jimmy built shelves with a local carpenter. Books donated by guests now filled the corners. Children read while their parents rested. Some wrote their own stories. All were welcome. Karen introduced garden pots out front. Herbs, tomatoes, small blooms. People added seeds, painted signs, pulled weeds. The cafe had spilled onto the sidewalk. Hope took root, literally. One night, the lights flickered. Jimmy checked the fuse box. It was fine. When he returned, Karen stood at the counter. The power's just reminding us. Light isn't always electric. He laughed. You should put that on the board. Brett and Grace became more than a cafe. It became a home with open doors. A lighthouse in the city's fog. Jimmy and Karen no longer questioned their place. They were exactly where they were meant to be. Karen began teaching cooking classes on weekends. People of all ages came, hands flowered with purpose. Jimmy assisted, usually burning something at least once. They laughed more than they learned, and that was enough. Healing often came in batter. A local news crew returned, hoping for a follow-up. Karen declined the interview, but offered soup. They ate in silence and left with gratitude. Sometimes, stories don't need cameras to shine. Sometimes, they just need to continue. Jimmy stood by the window one quiet morning. Karen joined him, as always. He looked at her and said, What if we never stop? She answered, Then maybe we'll always belong somewhere. And they stayed. That night, they closed early, lit candles, shared bread, played quiet music. No reason, no celebration, just presence. Karen raised a toast to what lasts. Jimmy added, and to who stays. The sign outside read, bread and grace, come as you are. But inside, something deeper glowed. A light not of bulbs, but of choice. The last guest left with a smile, and the last light stayed. Asterisk, asterisk, every act of kindness is a seed, and some grow into trees we never imagined. Karen gave away her last meal and received something no money could buy: belonging, purpose, and a story that keeps feeding others. Tell us in the comments, what part of this story touched your heart? Share with someone who needs a reminder that one moment of compassion can change everything. Asterisk, subscribe to the channel for more stories that feed the soul. Asterisk.